Apologies, technical difficulties. That will teach me to record in questionable weather. Uh, I was just starting to say that sometimes um, people do mean the crazy, or they do mean the wrong, or they do mean the weaker view. And whether that's true or false, it's really important that we always uh, adhere to the second principle, the principle of fidelity, where we must be faithful to their views. Um, Now and those two are in no way inconsistent. We present their views in the best light, but it's still their views and recognizable as their views and capture their views and maybe just clean it up a little. But that's fine. And so whenever we're dealing with anyone, and really anyone, you will just be a better person for doing this, whether it's a political opponent, your best friend, people in your family. When you're having a discussion, you should adhere to those and you'll just be better for it. So, part two, though, is to talk about how do we start going about sorting out when we hear a weird claim. And Dowden puts this all in terms of weird claims, but really it could apply to any claim, weird or not. So, uh, why does he focus on weird claims? Well, roughly speaking, we don't usually have to do a whole lot of extra gyrations to decide whether to accept or reject a common, normal, perfectly plausible claim. Absent reason to doubt it, we tend to accept reasonable claims. That is part of what I call the principle of credulity, which is why I accidentally mentioned it earlier. Well, if a student comes in and tells me it's raining, I'm going to say fine, unless it's 40 degrees below zero. And there's nothing wrong with that in principle. There's only certain contexts in which you should really examine plausible claims if something renders them implausible. And so even the notion of deciding whether to accept implies that it's a weird claim. And that's something I wish Dowden would have made a little clearer, but that's what's going on. So, a couple of things. One, weird is not a technical term, but it's synonymous with strange, which is synonymous with improbable, which is a technical term, right? So we're talking about improbable claims. Now, probability is set against background knowledge, and that's something that you never want to forget. Everybody has different background knowledge, which means something that is absolutely crazy sounding on its surface might not be crazy to somebody else. And that's why some of these issues come up. To take a fun example, I can tell you a very strange claim right now. I once knocked out heavyweight champion Stipe Miocic. So that's strange, and it might seem improbable to you if you don't know certain facts about it, but I have background information you don't, and other people have background information about me that you don't. And as such, it might be perfectly plausible to me, but wildly improbable to you, which is why something goes on called the burden of proof. This was mentioned later. I wish it had been announced sooner. The burden of proof is a dialectical device. It means whose job is it, whose duty is it, whose burden is it to defend their view. And roughly speaking, if I'm presenting something to you, which is very, very, very implausible, or just implausible, I guess, without all the varies, given your background knowledge, or even given what we might call common sense, the shared knowledge, then my burden is to convince you. And a lot of the evaluation here is when that falls short. Well, what would it take to convince somebody? So if I walk in and tell you I just saw an elephant in the quad, well, to my own view, I'd say, well, my eyes work. My senses are fine. I've taken no hallucinogens today, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't need to convince myself. But at the same time, I should very much recognize This is something that's bizarre. This is something that's very strange. It's highly improbable, which means that you, if I tell you I saw an elephant in the quad, would rightly be skeptical. Rightly. And so I might recognize, well, I have a higher burden of proof here, so maybe I'll give some context. Well, you might not know it, but the circus came to the college today, and oh look, I snapped a photo on my cell phone, and da 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 da. And so, whoever is knowingly presenting something that is improbable, given standard background knowledge, has the burden of proof. Let me convince you a little further that I knocked out Stipe Miocic. I am a good enough poker player to play in celebrity tournaments. He was playing in a celebrity tournament one time, and I knocked him out of the tournament. But I do love to go around saying I knocked out Stipe Miocic. So now, will you believe that? I don't know. So now it's a little more plausible. And so I might add, oh, look, and in most of my critical thinking courses, I teach a whole unit on probable reasoning. Or you could look up my name and find out I placed second in a national event in poker, and things like this. I can start to move that burden off of me and turn an improbable comment into one that you do accept. And there's nothing inconsistent about that. And one of the things that I really wish would be emphasized a little more is we're talking about initial views, sometimes called prior probability. When you hear something crazy, you should be skeptical at first. That doesn't make you a skeptic. That doesn't make you a dogmatist. That makes you someone who understands probability. Improbable things are not likely. And so our job as critical thinkers is to find out, well, when do we leave them in that category? Probably false. Or when do we accept them, and how? And again, this is more of an art than a science, but there's some really helpful tools here to help us weed out some of the good and the bad. So one of the very, very, very big things, possibly the biggest, is the credibility of the source. And this is a little bit related to arguments from authority. So when we're talking about authorities as the sources, then their credibility is equivalent to their authoritativeness. And we've already talked about how to evaluate that. But what if we're not talking about an authority? Well, how do we evaluate the credibility of the sources? Some of it's the same. So vested interest is something to watch out for. When Fox News says something bad about a Democrat, I don't really take it that seriously because they have this vested interest in always making Democrats look bad. And mutatis mutandis, MSNBC making a Republican look bad. It's not that interesting because, well, even if what they say is true, because they do look bad sometimes, they don't have the credibility to convince me if the claim is an implausible one. Now, interestingly enough, and this is something that Dowden doesn't mention, there is a reverse rule that if somebody is saying the exact opposite of what you expect them to in terms of vested interest, I think that actually adds some plausibility. So if a coal mining executive is talking about the cataclysmic effects of man-made climate change, I am much more likely to believe them because they're saying the exact opposite of what their vested interest would do. Or similarly, if Fox News compliments Joe Biden or MSNBC compliments something Donald Trump did, well, now I've got all sorts of alarm bells going off in my head because when someone is specifically speaking against their vested interest, that really is a solid indicator of credibility. Not in the textbook, but something you want to pay attention to. What else do we know about credibility? There are people who are honest and people who are dishonest, of course. The person's honesty, their character, And also the consequences of them lying are things that we should pay attention to. Dowden doesn't say as much about the latter, but think of news. Well, if you post a knowingly false story, knowingly, you open yourself up to lawsuits. And there are very specific consequences for telling deliberate falsehoods in the news community. Something people forget nowadays for some reason. Now, that doesn't stop them from doing sneaky stuff like writing, like literally, I'm being totally literal here. I've seen this. So they have a news piece and they have, the normal news in this font, and they have the word opinion this big. There are loopholes for this, but yeah, think in terms of, well, what are the probable consequences of them lying, and so bring in some of the causal reasoning from the previous unit, and I hope it's starting to become clear, both when we're talking about authority and we're talking about the honesty and credibility of a source. We are talking about induction, which means, as always, a credible person can be wrong, but also it's scaling. People could be more and less credible. That could be in general, or that could be in specific context. So, for instance, I try very hard not to say anything false at all times, but I try especially hard to be careful when I'm lecturing my students. And so you might think that that gives me some extra credibility, not in terms of it being an authority on logic, which is a separate issue, but just in general honesty. Or some people know that I really, really, really love my spouse. And sometimes when we're playing cards, there'll be a flop, and I'll say, "Oh, that's perfect, like a Sophie." That's my wife, Sophie, and everybody just folds because they know that I would not actually use that as a bluff, because the consequences of my saying a falsehood in that case are actually something that I would not want to accept, and so those are things you could watch out for with credibility. Now, there are certain things that work really hard to be credible. This is we talked about scholarly consensus of authorities, and very similarly, peer-reviewed articles. But there's also more and less credible news sources and things like that. But yes, credibility is the very first thing you should watch. But there's other things to do too. Notice I just answered and mentioned consensus. Very similarly, you could seek second opinions. And so the example Dowden gives, well, if you hear a bizarre news story, just see if anybody else is reporting it. That's a really easy way to tell if something very, very strange happened. And there was kind of a tabloid-style story last week about a dog who was hit its like 30th birthday or something like that, which is crazy on its surface, but there's a whole lot of documentation about it. You keep looking into it and you find out the Guinness Records people know it, and they're usually pretty careful about confirming records. Notice I just combined seeking a second opinion and credibility of the source. Well, a second opinion that was credible reported it. These all come together. Now let's talk about 3 things you should really watch out for as like your red flags when you're talking about stories. 1, anecdotes. This is why we have Unit 3 as Unit 3. An anecdote is just someone reporting their own experience. And people just do this all the time with medical stuff, and it's terrible. It's unhealthy and it's dangerous. If we extrapolate from that, because an anecdote is it's a tiny, tiny, tiny sample size. And so it's statistically meaningless in most topics. And so person X reported Y is perfectly true. But then to extrapolate Y from that is an extreme hasty generalization, which is why we have to be aware of anecdotes. Now, to tie what I said earlier, anecdotes come up a lot in news sources because they can let people draw their own conclusions. They report the anecdote, but then they don't do the statistical analysis to show how meaningless that anecdote is. So there's that, and it ties into, of course, all the superstition and general fallacies involved that we talked about last unit with small sample sizes. The second kind of red flag to watch out for is sensationalizing. Very often, truth is boring and falsities are memorable. And fake stories get circled around all the time because they're interesting. There was actually a sociological experiment, so to speak, that was talking about a medically noted virgin birth. So went the story. In the Civil War, a bullet tore off a soldier's testicle, and the bullet continued and embedded in a nearby woman's uterus, and 9 months later there was a baby. And this was discussed in a medical journal at one point, and later the author of that discussion revealed he'd actually made up the story, not actually because he was trying to do anything duplicitous. He was actually trying to test the effects of sensationalizing. He was actually using it as an experiment to see how many people would cite it, because they'd cite the original source, of which there was none, and they were actually just citing this particular, they were just trusting this article. But this story still comes up, even though the medical community is now well aware that this was, hoax is not the right word, sociology experiment that was probably a little unethical. But it still comes up as if it's the real thing. Why? Because it's a neat sounding story. It's one of those, wow, mind blown kind of stories that because it's sensational, what's interesting gets passed on as a meme in conversation. What's boring does not. And so we should always beware of sensationalizing stories. And then very similarly, something we always have to be wary of, believing a story because we want it to be true. And so, of course, there was this silly nonsense of Pizzagate, that all this terrible stuff went on in the basement of this pizza place, eventually spawned QAnon, and it's because people really wanted to believe that their political opponents were these terrible, terrible, terrible people. By the way, I'm not making a political point here. Pizzagate is really easy to disprove. All this stuff went on in the basement of this pizza place, and the place doesn't have a basement. It's not hard. But anyway, there's this sensationalizing aspect that if we want it to be true, we are much more likely to accept it. This is something we've seen all semester. So just in general, as a check, well, is this claim being defended because it's sensational, because it's something people want to be true? Am I trying to find a reason to accept it because I want it to be true? Those are things we must look at from a critical thinking framework. Lastly, and this is all I'll say for this video, is we have to be aware of our own fallibility in terms of observation. There have been numerous studies in psychology, sociology, even neuroscience that show that humans are actually pretty bad at these things. Our brains have an ability to kind of rewrite our own memory, and you really have to be trained especially well to be a good observer. And so we should really be careful when we're talking about what is our own observation to the incredible. And you might think of this in terms of, say, the Loch Ness Monster. Well, people have heard all of this stuff about this creature, and the only reason to go to Loch Ness, it is an ugly, boring area. The only thing to do there is hope you can see Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster. And so when uh, the most likely explanation for all these sightings is there's these waves that kind of ripple in a certain way that could then move kind of slowly, that if the right kind of day and the light strikes off of them, um, can make you see these things. And people genuinely think they have seen Nessie and would swear that it had eyes and all of this stuff because uh, they're the subconscious is kind of filling in and merging, etc. By the way, Loch Ness Monster is another one of those. It would sure be interesting if it wasn't so easy to disprove. There's not the loch does not have the kind of nutrients to support enough small fish to feed large fish to have that kind of thing. Or to give one more example of sensationalizing, the Bermuda Triangle is, ooh, look, there's all these disappearances that happen. And there's this weird story about the one World War II pilot who something weird happened and the whole fleet disappeared, and his last transmission was "Don't come after us." Well, that's sensational. I really want that to be true. Perhaps. And you take 2 seconds to research and it just falls apart. So Bermuda Triangle has the exact same number statistically of disappeared planes and boats as any other similarly weathered part of the ocean. A little less interesting now. And as it turns out, that story about the fighter pilot, completely fabricated. We know it was fabricated. And so, sometimes being a critical thinker does make the world a little boring. But these are just examples of when something's sensational, we want it to be true. We want there to be mystery. That's exciting. It gives a little spice to our daily lives. But ultimately, if our goal is to pursue truth, we have to make the world boring, or at least wherever the evidence leads us. All right. See you next time.